Linux power users have long relied on AMD for solid GPU performance, but with AMD abandoning the high-end graphics card market and Nvidia historically having its compatibility quirks on Linux, it's fair to wonder what's next for high-end Linux gaming and content creation. Today, I'm building a high-performance Nvidia-powered PC to see if distros like Nobara, built specifically for gamers and creators with supposed out-of-the-box Nvidia support, can help smooth out the rough edges and keep Linux viable for those of us who demand the best from our hardware. But spoiler alert, things didn't go quite as planned.
It's the money.
Hey guys, CJ here with Elevated Systems. In this video, we're diving into the potential future of high-end Linux PCs. With the hardware landscape shifting and some serious hurdles to overcome, I'm going with Nobara to see if it can bridge the gap and deliver a seamless experience. I'll quickly run through the components I selected, then move into setting up Nobara. After that, we'll test it out with AAA games and content creation workflows to see if Linux can still keep up with top-tier hardware. And trust me, the results may or may not surprise you. Let's do this. Just like with my Mint build, my component selection this time is all about the case. And once again, I'm going with a Fractal case. This time the Era 2. This case is actually one of the two reasons why I decided to switch things up and go for a sleeker desktop workstation. I originally bought this massive Thermaltake Tower 500, planning to go all out on a flashy gaming build. But before I got around to it, Fractal dropped the ERA2, and from the moment I saw it previewed earlier this year, I really wanted to check it out. Now, Fractal used to send me all their new cases to review, but after I gave one a less than stellar review, I guess they ghosted me. No big deal though. I'm not petty. If they put out a case I want, I'll just buy it myself. So here it is. And of course, if a case comes in any other color than black or white, I can't resist, so I went with the Midnight Blue version. It's basically a larger, more organic looking version of the Fractatera I used for the Mint PC build. It's still a micro ITX case, but has room for more and larger components. For example, this case fits up to a 280mm AIO, so I picked up an NZXT Kraken 280 and can handle an SFXL power supply, so I went with the Corsair SF1000L. Some of the components are carryovers from the Mint build, like the MSI B650i Edge Wi-Fi motherboard. Now, I did consider upgrading to an X670 or X870 board to get that Gen 5 M.2 slot for faster editing, but the only mini ITX board I can find in stock was well over $400, and honestly, you're not going to notice much benefit from PCIe Gen 5 right now, since SSD speeds are still software limited in most editing suites. Until the software catches up, we'll be just fine with our more affordable B650 board, a Gen 4 Crucial P3 Plus SSD, and 32GB of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory. Now, I actually ordered a 64GB kit of this Corsair RAM for this build, but Amazon messed up and sent me another 32GB kit instead. I just noticed it when setting up for this shot, and since we've only got 2 DIMM slots on this mini ITX board, the extra kit is pretty much useless. Anyway, 32GB will work, although 64 would have been better. Speaking of better, let's talk about our graphics card. I went with an MSI RTX 4080 Super Expert, plenty of power for gaming and 16GB of GDDR6 for content creation. Best part, I got it for dirt cheap because the original owner tried to water cool it and broke some SMDs off the PSP, and it was dead. But after soldering on a few new components, I managed to fix it. Great for me, but it's still one of the cheaper 4080 Super cards out there at about $1,100 new. And finally, the second big reason I changed up this build, the CPU. I tried to buy a Ryzen 7 7800X 3D, but apparently they're no longer available anywhere. Weird, because I know the 9800X 3D is supposed to be released any day now, but AMD didn't pull the 5700X 3D when the 7800X 3D launched, so this caught me off guard. Anyway, I went with my Ryzen 9 7900X 3D instead. We'll see a slight drop in gaming performance, less so on Linux, but the extra cores will be fantastic for content creation. It also makes this build a serious 3D design and rendering powerhouse if that's your thing. All right, that's all the components. Now it's time to roll that build montage and see how it comes together. How's that for a speed montage? Data driven, of course. Long build montages cause viewership to drop off fast, so I'm just giving the people what they want. And what y'all typically skip ahead to are the build notes, so let's get into it. Let me tell you, using components like a 280mm AIO and an SFXL PSU and a massive graphics card in a small case like this, challenging is an understatement. First thing I did was to remove the 2.5-inch drive tray to give me a little extra space. I also had the brilliant idea to set up the AIO in a pull configuration, placing the fans on top so I wouldn't have to worry about cables interfering with the fans. Sounds smart. Unfortunately, while this works with a 240mm AIO, the end tanks on the 280 hit this tiny section of the case, making it impossible to fully install the cooler. So plan B, I 3D printed a couple of fan grates and went with the traditional push config instead, and as you can probably guess, cable management was a nightmare. There's just a few centimeters between the PSU cable connection and the AIO fans, plus you've got to route the AIO tubes through there, and then there's barely any room for the graphics card 12-volt high power connector. I also spent a lot of time cramming everything in, not so neatly, but at least it was out of the way enough for the case to slide back on. And then I realized I forgot to plug the power cable into the PSU, which, fun fact, is impossible to do once it's installed, so I had to cut the zip ties, pull the PSU out, and redo everything, only to discover that one of the AIO fans was dead. Awesome. So I pulled it apart again, swapped out the NZXT fans for a couple of Arctic P14s, and then had to reroute and tie down cables to keep them from pushing the fan grates into the fan blades. After all that, I finally got the system assembled and running, although it looks like the power LED cable might have disconnected somewhere along the way. Honestly, I don't even care at this point. Listen, mini ITX builds are a pain in the ass, and of course, I made it harder on myself by packing the Era 2 to its absolute max capacity, but at the end of the day, you gotta love the results. All right, time to install Nobara. Now, if you haven't heard of Nobara, it's built on Fedora, but with all the tweaks and optimizations already done for you, especially for gaming and content creations. It's got everything baked in right out of the box, so you're not wasting hours setting up drivers, codecs, and patches. Whether you're gaming or editing video, Nobara just works, saving you time and headaches. Think of it as Fedora with all the boring stuff handled for you so you can get straight to what matters, playing your games or getting creative. It was created and is maintained by Linux legend Thomas Kreider, aka Glorious Agro, who also makes Proton GE. I've never actually tinkered with Nobara before, so this will be my first time, which is reason enough to give it a try. But here's the thing. When asked why he made Nobara, Glorious Agro said he did it for his dad, so his dad would have a Linux distro that just worked for him. Now, if a guy is willing to create and maintain a whole distro for his dad, this dad is definitely going to give it a shot. Today, I'm going to show you a different way to preview install Nobara or any Linux ISO using Ventoy. First, head over to ventoy.net, and on the download page, I'll grab the Windows installer since I'm using a Windows laptop. Once downloaded, extract the archive and launch Ventoy to disk. I'll select the USB drive I've plugged in and then click install. Process is super quick, and when it's done, you'll have what looks like a blank thumb drive. But don't worry, this is actually a special partition where you can drop as many ISOs as will fit. Next, go to nobaraproject.org, and on the download page, you'll see several options. We definitely need the Nvidia ISO, and I'm going with the official version that uses the Plasma desktop. It's pretty intuitive interface, especially for users transitioning from Windows, but if you prefer, there are also GNOME and KDE versions available. I'll drag the Nobara ISO into the Ventoy drive, and now we're ready to go. Eject the drive from your laptop or computer and plug it into the desktop. Now let's boot up. The first thing I want to do is enter the UEFI menu and select the USB as my boot drive. Now I'll save and reboot, and you'll see Ventoy launch showing a menu of all the ISOs on your drive. In my case, I only have Nobara, so I'll select that, boot in normal mode, and launch Nobara 40. After a few minutes, you'll be in the live environment and the installer will pop up. From there, the installation process is super simple, so let's get right into it. You don't need to be connected to Wi-Fi for the installation, but I'm going to connect just to make things easier. Now let's walk through the installer, which is very familiar and intuitive. First, I'll pick my location and keyboard layout. Next, for the install partition, I've got my 2TB P3 Plus selected. Since I already have an operating system installed on that drive, I get the option to install Nobara alongside it for a dual boot setup, but I'm going all in on Nobara, so I'll choose Erase Disk to wipe it clean. From here, you'll set up your username, computer name, and password. You can choose whether you want to auto log in at startup, but I highly recommend keeping the use same password for admin account option checked. Once you've done that, click next, verify all your information, and then hit install. Once the installation is complete, check reboot now and click done. When the computer restarts, you'll be greeted by the Nobara welcome app along with the notification that the system needs to be updated. Click yes, as you'll need to do this right away. Enter your password and the system update will take care of everything. It could take several minutes and you'll need to reboot again once it's done. After the restart, the welcome app pops up again, and under first steps, you'll see most of the essentials are already taken care of. The latest Nvidia driver is installed, all the recommended Nobara tweaks are activated, and you can always revisit this app later to install more apps or web apps. Under recommended additions, you'll find several commonly used apps with automated install scripts. For example, if I want to install OBS with all its dependencies so it hopefully just works out of the box, I just click install and it's done with zero effort on my part. We'll come back to these optional steps later since we need to install Steam and DaVinci Resolve first. Below that, you've got links to troubleshooting, documentation, and ways to join the Nobara Project's Discord and subreddit. Plus, if you're feeling generous, there are links to contribute to the project. For now, I'm going to minimize the welcome app because we'll come back to it later. Alright, let's get our gaming launcher set up. Steam is pre-installed, so just double-click the desktop icon to launch it. It'll update automatically, and you can log in once it's done. After Steam is up and running, head back to the Welcome app. Under Optional Steps, you'll see the option to install Proton GE. Select the latest Proton GE version and install it. Once that's done, go back to Steam, click Steam, then Settings, and under Compatibility, activate Enable Steam Play for all other titles. Steam will need to restart, so let it do that. When it's back up, go back to the compatibility menu and in the dropdown, select the GE Proton version you just installed. Restart Steam one more time, and now you're ready to install your game library and start gaming. We'll get to gaming in a bit. However, if you open the menu under Games, you'll find that Lutris is already also installed. Lutris is an open source gaming platform for Linux that makes it super easy to install and run games from platforms like Ubisoft and Epic Games, while using Wine to handle Windows standalone titles. For example, with just a few clicks, I can install the Epic Game Store. Once that's done, I can launch it, log in, and access my game library. Sounds great, right? Well, here's where things took a little turn. When I tried to install a game, I ran into an error. Despite trying multiple Wine and GE Proton versions to troubleshoot, unfortunately, this was just the first of many issues I encountered with Nobara. As pretty much an exclusive Steam gamer, I was happy to find that the 4 Steam games I tested launched and ran without any immediately noticeable issues. I ran through Black Myth Wukong, Cyberpunk 2077, Starfield, and Warhammer 40k Space Marine. Everything seemed fine except for some significant texture problems in Cyberpunk. Since Mango HUD and Go Overlay come pre-installed on Nobara, I configured the overlay and set it to launch with each game. Now, because I've been using this exact CPU and GPU combo in my main gaming rig for almost a year, I immediately noticed something was off. In Black Myth Wukong, for example, the 1440p cinematic with high ray tracing, settings that have been smooth for me in Windows, were giving me barely playable frame rates on Nobara. In fact, when you compare a benchmark from Nobara to one from Windows using the same hardware and settings, there's a huge performance drop. The same was true in Cyberpunk 2077, where Nobara gave me a whopping 31% less in performance. And unfortunately, this performance hit was consistent across all the games I tested. Now, even though I'm using high-end hardware to try and compensate for the performance drop, Nobara does come with Gamescope pre-installed and configured. Gamescope is a Linux tool designed to boost gaming performance by creating a lightweight environment specifically for running games. Think of it as a mini desktop that focuses all your system's resources on the game, helping it run smoother. Unfortunately, every time I tried to use Gamescope, the game just froze. After a quick Reddit search, I found that Gamescope is actually broken in Nobara 40. However, I suspect it's probably an Nvidia compatibility problem. In any case, no luck there. Now, gaming was only half the mission. I also planned to edit this video on this system, but unfortunately, that didn't go as planned either. Long story short, DaVinci Resolve didn't work. I ran into a bug during installation, which turns out to be a known Fedora 40 issue. I used the workaround to get it installed and then headed back to the Nobara app to install all the patches and fixes that you usually have to do manually to get Resolve working properly. But even with all that, Resolve still wouldn't cooperate. First, it froze up just trying to import media, then once I did manage to get media in, it wasn't visible on the timeline. While X264 and ProRes footage played fine on the system, BRAW wasn't working in Resolve or even in the Blackmagic RAW player. And finally, after saving a project, I couldn't open it again. I spent several hours trying to troubleshoot it, but the bottom line is it just didn't work. All right, let's wrap this up. At times, building this PC felt like trying to shove 30 pounds of crap into a 20-pound bag, but overall, I'm really happy with how it turned out. The build is bold, powerful, and definitely unique, If you're thinking about replicating this setup, one thing I definitely recommend is spending the extra cash on a standard length SFX PSU with more flexible cables, something like the Corsair SF1000. Trust me, it'll save you some headaches. Now, let's talk about Nobara. I love the concept behind the project, but I've got to be honest, Nobara 40 apparently has a few bugs that need ironing out. Between the DaVinci Resolve issues, the broken game scope, and the significant performance drop, it's hard to ignore the flaws, and just so you know, I pulled the CPU and GPU from this build and tested them on my main desktop to rule out any hardware or power delivery issues. It wasn't the hardware. The performance gap between Windows and Nobara is still there. All of this makes Nobara a tough sell for Linux newcomers, especially those who are already a bit nervous about switching to a new operating system. But before anyone gets mad at me for calling out the work of a guy whose main goal is to give his dad a smooth, tailored Linux experience, let me clarify. Almost all of these problems, like the X-Wayland compositor crashes, performance issues when translating DirectX, especially to DXVK, and media decoding problems, are really due to the Nvidia user space proprietary drivers in Linux. So to be clear, Nobara is a fantastic choice for Linux beginners as a simple terminal-free transition from Windows. You can stick to familiar GUIs, jump into gaming, or start creating content right away, just as long as you're using AMD or Intel graphics. Unfortunately, while Nvidia has made some strides in opening up their drivers, many of the same issues that have historically plagued the Linux environment still exist, and despite AMD stepping away from high-end graphics card space, I don't think Nvidia will put much effort into filling that gap, and it all really comes down to market share. For the first quarter of fiscal year 2025, Nvidia reported a record revenue of $22.6 billion in the AI data center market compared to just $2.6 billion in the consumer graphics market, with Linux holding less than 5% of the desktop PC market. Even if Nvidia had 100% saturation of those systems, which it doesn't, their best possible revenue from Linux users would be under $130 million, or about 0.5% of their total revenue. Essentially, that's a rounding error for them. Now, I really hope I'm wrong, but I don't see Nvidia going much beyond the slow and sporadic improvements they've been making. That said, this probably won't affect too many people. Most Linux systems out there still rely on lower to mid-range hardware. Linux users tend to be frugal and don't typically drop big money on bleeding edge, highest end gear. But for the few RX 7900 XTX owners out there, this might be your last high-end build, so cherish it. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you want to see more PC builds, Linux experiments, and tech reviews, make sure to subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss anything. I've got some exciting stuff coming up and you won't want to miss it. I'll see you in the next one.